Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.
You're listening to Tony Graham on Binjang 91.5 on this Remembrance Day, and I have in the studio, in Studio 2 online, Matthew Dickinson to have a discussion about the last meeting of council, which was to do with the 3 standing committee meetings. How are you going, Matthew?
Yeah, good, thanks. Actually, it's always nice to go to an event like Remembrance Day, so very solemn event, but it's great to see so much respect in the community still to attend events like Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, the commemoration of the fallen. So it's it puts you in a very reflective mood. So I'm in a reflective mood at the moment, Tony.
Okay, well, that's very appropriate, I think. Remembrance Day is a very big day in this country and across the world, of course.
It is. And actually one thing that I really like is the fact that they've still got the competitions, the school competitions. So we're talking about Remembrance Day 105 years ago. In 1918, obviously, was the time when the guns fell silent, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And the fact that we've got the school kids who are still entering competition, so there were 2 school kids today who won prizes for their compositions. The fact that the teachers, and obviously through the RSL sub-branch here in Dubbo, the teachers and the school kids are involved in that process, it just makes those kids look back and reflect on what happened in 1918 and what happened, I suppose, since then in terms of world wars and conflicts. It just gives a bit of reflection on that history and gets those school kids involved. And I'm sure in the classroom they'll ask questions of their teacher and there'll be some thoughts. And the 2 compositions today, the 2 winners of those 2 competitions they had there today, I think were absolutely wonderful compositions. Yeah,
I think it's really important because the price of freedom can never be underestimated. If you've never had to fight for it, you never necessarily value it, which is what you might expect. But at least with Remembrance Day, there's a chance there for people to say, freedom does come at a price.
Exactly.
Now, Matthew, the standing committee meetings on Thursday were interesting. What really came out of that, what shone through, I suppose, was rates. A very contentious issue at any time. And we're talking about rate increases due to inflationary pressures and cost shifting from the state government primarily, I understand, and things like that. So where do you think things are going to go with that?
Well, it was interesting, and certainly if you want to get people interested in council or interested in a council meeting, mention a rate increase and suddenly the interest level goes up quite dramatically, Tony. So that's maybe a good tactic from council to look at that discussion to get people interested and involved in council. One of the things that we've got at the moment is a number of years of poor results from council. And when this council came on, when the new council was elected in December 2021, the previous 3 financial years had resulted in approximately a $21 million net operating loss for council. Now, we've got reserves there, so you can get away with that for a short period of time, but you can't keep doing that forever. Now, that was after the amalgamation, bringing 2 councils together. There was a fair bit of money on the table from the state government at that period in time. And so when you look at that, maybe the finances weren't managed at that point in time in the best possible way. This council couldn't really do much in the 2021-2022 financial year. We only got elected halfway through that, and obviously the budget had been set. So there was another $8.8 million loss in that particular year. The first chance that we had as a council to really start to address this was the 2022-2023 financial year. And we didn't have a great result in that year, a $7.7 million loss. So you can see this consistent trend of multiple years of losses there. Now, I think what you mentioned in the intro is spot on. There are some inflationary pressures there. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt in my mind cost shifting. In fact, ever since I was first elected to council, I've seen little bits and pieces of just small costs being shifted across to council. And that's been an ongoing process and something that certainly councils across the state have talked about on a regular basis. I think the other thing that's probably in there, Tony, is that the expectation from the community has increased from what the council can deliver. So the community expectation generally is they want stuff from council. And if I look at the submissions that went in for the budget in the last financial year for this financial year, so June this year, those submissions that we considered, if we said yes to all of those submissions, that would have increased our expenditure by about $8 million. So I didn't see lots of submissions saying, please reduce our services, please reduce the amount of money you're spending on things, please reduce anything. People typically in those submissions typically ask for more things, more services, more facilities, more infrastructure, a whole range of extra things. And so, again, with all of those combined pressures, we need to look at our finances, which we've been doing, Tony, and that's one of the things that was certainly considered at the committee meetings on Thursday night. What do we do in relation to that? And at any time, whether it's your household budget, your personal budget, a business budget, you've got a couple of options there. One is to decrease your expenditure. One is to increase your income. We've probably got a third option in there as well, Tony. We've got some assets, business assets that are underperforming business assets. I'm talking about things like livestock markets, childcare, caravan parks, some various assets there. Is it time that we leased out some of those assets? Is it time that we looked at maybe selling some of those assets? Now, I don't want to scare people there. We haven't certainly had serious conversations about that, but they're the sort of things you've got to consider. So it's not just let's put the rates up, that's it. We've been working, we've had a number of workshops, we've had councillors gathered on several occasions, we've got some consultants in, we've been talking about a whole range of these different pressures on our finances and what do we do about it. And of course that was one of the main things discussed at the council meeting. Do we look at a special rate variation?
Yes, Matthew, one of the interesting things to look at would be the revenue, the total revenue of each year, and also compare the operational expenses versus the capital expenditures. It used to be the case when I looked at this some years back that 29% of the revenue came from ratepayers, and 71% of the revenues council got was mostly capital expenditures from grants and mostly from the state government, some federal. So it'd be interesting to see if the ratios have changed there. That might indicate the extent of what cost shifting is going on.
The ratios are still similar now, Tony. And if I look at our last 2 years, for example, the budget for this current year and then last year, we had in last year about $71.8 million in rates and annual charges that came in out of a total income of about $190.5 million. So if you look at that, that's around that 38% was from the rates and annual charges. And if you look at the budget for the current financial year we're in, there's about $73 million coming in from rates and annual charges out of a budget of about $185 million. So you're talking about somewhere in the vicinity of 40% there coming from those rates and annual charges. Keep in mind when we talk about the net operating result, one thing that does confuse people a little bit, Tony, is that, again, if we look at the financial year just finished, we talked about a $7.7 million net operating result loss for that year. And again, this is off the budget figures there. But that includes, for example, $49.6 million of depreciation. And essentially that's a non-cash contribution, if you like, but that's money that's being depreciated, put aside for assets that need to be renewed in years to come. If we look at the current financial year we're in, we've got in that budget about $50 million. And when I say depreciation, it's depreciation, impairment of non-financial assets, and amortisation. So you've got a few components in there, but it's basically that depreciation. And if you look at that, and again, this is the accounting standards that we use, the state government tells us these accounting standards, but if you look at that, it's probably a little bit different to a home budget. Not a lot of people put away money in their budget each month or each week for example, their TV. Their TV might die in 4 years' time, so they put money aside for it each week. Most people don't do that. But in terms of our assets, we've got some certain formulas we've got to use that we've got to actually put in our accounts that depreciation for the replacement of those assets. So when we talk about those net operating results, those losses or those gains from there, keep in mind that that includes a large expense there for depreciation.
Interesting. Do you have any further comments to make on the rate situation?
Well, I will talk about the decision that council made, and again, this was only a committee meeting, so it's not a final decision of council, but I will talk a little bit about the recommendation that will go through to council in 2 weeks' time on the 23rd of November, the next council meeting. So there were a couple of options there, and obviously it was a recommendation from councillors, so it could be any option could be on the table. The two that were in the report that went through to the committee meeting gave essentially two options, and I'll talk about those in broad brushstrokes. One option was to look at a special rate variation for next financial year. Now, go through a process where we'd have to come up with the exact amount, and the amount that was talked about was a 10% increase each year for 4 years, keeping in mind that the rate pegging amount, that wouldn't be 10% on top of rate pegging. It would be 10% including whatever rate pegging amount it was. So, for example, if the government says, or if IPART says it's a 5% rate peg, then we'd be talking about a 5% increase on top of the rate peg amount. So one option was go for a 10% increase each year for 4 years. So it's a cumulative increase or compound increase, and start that in 24-25. Now, if we went with that option, we'd have to get lots of communication out to the community now. We'd have to be having that consultation and those discussions over December and January. Not a great time for submissions, not a great time to get that feedback from the community. And if you're being cynical, Tony, you could say that Council was deliberately doing it over that period of time because they were trying to limit the amount of feedback from the community by doing it in a period that's such a busy period that you might not necessarily get great feedback. The submission to IPART would have to go in by the 5th of February. So we would have no option but to go through and do all that consultation process essentially now, immediately, have a final council resolution at the end of January, presumably, to go to that 5th of February deadline. The second option from councillors was to look at doing the consultation process, looking at a special rate variation, etc., but not doing it for the 24-25 year, doing it for the 25-26 year, so that we've got over a year of time to go out in that public consultation, that discussion with the community, because it really is, do you want your rates to go up? Do you want your services to decrease? Do you want some of our business assets to be removed? So that's really the discussion that was happening on Thursday night. In that discussion, the councillors decided to defer any discussions around that rate increase for a year. And it doesn't mean it will go ahead in a year. What that means is that the consideration of a special rate variation will be put off for a year and deferred till 25-26. What I find absolutely fascinating in all of that discussion and process, Tony, is that unfortunately you do get a little bit of an echo chamber on social media where people maybe put up sensational comments and maybe comments that are designed to stir up emotions, and that doesn't really help the discussion. And of course, if you're a councillor, the time you can actually make a difference is sitting there at a committee meeting, at a council meeting, and bringing forward those points of view. And it is unfortunate that some councillors choose to have lots of their commentary on social media rather than in a council meeting when you can actually make a difference. So it doesn't really help. Social media doesn't really help that good, honest, open communication and that good open flow of feedback, especially when people put up limited information, sensational information, and only put up part of the facts, not the entire story.
So you're really alluding there to the concept that there might be a councillor or two who say nothing in the formulation of policies about these matters, but wait until it's all finished before they come out with a political message about all of this. That's very disappointing to hear, Matthew, I have to say.
Well, yes, you're right, because the beauty of council, one of the things I love about council, Tony, is it's raw democracy. You've got 10 councillors sitting around having a discussion that can go back and forth, can go around, and everyone can put their point of view forward. No one's going to be thrown out the door, or no one's going to be victimised for having an opinion. And at the end of that discussion, after all the points of view are put forward, we ask for a vote and you put your hands up. And if you've got a certain view and it's got a good enough argument behind that view, then you'll get the majority of those councillors. So I love that about the raw democracy we have at council. And again, councillors should, and I think they do in the majority, take advantage of the fact that they've got that ability. Saying things on social media, saying things to your next door neighbour, that's not where the decisions are made. Making those decisions in the chamber is where the decisions are made.
Yes, well said there. Matthew, just getting on from the budget now and talking about the situation where, the revenue that council gets, where it comes from, particularly when it comes to big capital expenditures. We're getting on to the next subject. Where's the money going to come from, or what's the process? Well, we do know that the low-level bridge here in Wellington, or the Duke of Wellington Bridge, is in need of a massive injection of money to fix that situation up, and that there is an application that's going in to the state government. I'm not sure if it's also partially funded by the feds, but certainly as a point of disaster relief funding, the application is being prepared. Is that true?
Yeah, so the application is being prepared. We'll need to get that application in. There's a closing date in December. We'll obviously make that closing date. We need to make sure we've got the numbers that line up, got as much data, as much information as possible. We are talking about public money here, Tony, and that's one of the really important things that I think people forget about sometimes is they'd love to see something funded. Yes, we would, but we've got to mount a good enough argument to the government when we put those applications in to say we would like this to be funded and here's all the data and all the information as to why it should be funded, not just, gee, it seems like a good idea, can you give us $20 million? Because that's the sort of quantum we're talking about for the particular repairs that we need for that entry and that riverbank area there for the Duke of Wellington Bridge. So we're still preparing that application at the moment. We're going through that process. Our staff are going through that process, and that will be lodged before the closing date in December. And then we'll just have to keep lobbying the various ministers and smiling nicely and asking for that money, please, and seeing how we go in that. If we don't get that funding, then we'll have to look at other options there. But at this stage, we're hoping that we'll be able to get the funding for that bridge.
Okay, and the next subject is Mitchell Creek, which my understanding is that council is going to fund that itself if it can't get grant funding, and you actually are looking at getting some help with grant funding, I believe. And where are we at with the process here now?
So council has made the decision, Tony, that that's too important a piece of infrastructure to just leave as it is at the moment and hope for the best and keep applying for grants, and then maybe one day when we finally get one to actually build that bridge out there. So we are going ahead with it. Again, we don't love the idea that that's coming out of council's funds because we're talking about a quantum of around $3 million for that particular project, but we need to do that, and we'll still be putting in funding applications for that bridge to cover the cost of that bridge. I've already had discussions with the Honourable Jenny Aitchison, MP, who's the Minister for Regional Transport and Roads, and I'll go through and keep having those conversations and keep reminding Jenny and anyone else in the government who cares to listen to me about it. But essentially what we've got to do is build that bridge. We'll hopefully get some funding back for that, but we need to have that infrastructure in place. We'll be going out to tender for that. Probably before the end of the year those applications will be open for that particular tender, and then we'll go through that normal tender process. They'll have time to put tender applications in. We'll come back to council and judge which one of those is the best, and then get construction underway for that bridge. So I can't tell you a definite time frame before that's finished, but it is progressing, and we'll see those tender documents open up before the end of the year.
And we've been listening to Matthew Dickinson, the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, on a report about the outcomes of the 3 standing committee meetings held on Thursday. Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Tony. Always my pleasure. Talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Fantastic. I look forward to that.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.